Today we are in the second part of a series on shame. Shame. Now, if you were here last week, you know that we talked a lot about shame and how we understand it and what it does to us. We're going to kind of be picking apart this whole concept over the next couple of weeks. Shame, we said, is this universal toxic disease that affects everything about us. It affects our lives. It affects our relationships, the way we see ourselves, the way we see other people. And for me, like the first time I was introduced to the concept of shame, I just kind of thought of it as like next level embarrassment. You know, like maybe you've been embarrassed before. And if it's bad enough, well, then maybe we'll say we're ashamed. Like I remember one year for Christmas Eve, my cousins, they were older than me. They like to goof around with us a little bit. And so they were really into like pantsing us, which was great. Except one time my cousin got a real firm grip and he didn't just grab my shorts, he got like my boxers underneath and boom, you know, and then it's like this moment of exposure and it's like, oh no, deep embarrassment, that's shame, right? Well, if you were here with us last week, you know that shame is so much more than that. We said that really, shame could be, maybe, but could be the central issue with the human race, like with what at the core of what it means to be a broken, imperfect human being. We said that shame is something that often goes misdiagnosed, like we'll have issues in our lives and we'll call it other things when really it's shame manifesting itself in some destructive way. Sometimes it goes undiagnosed. Sometimes we've been living with it forever and we don't even realize we're carrying it. Shame has made a home for a lot of us in our lives. Like we've just gotten used to carrying shame. And in some places, sometimes, often, shame makes a home in church, where churches become an atmosphere or atmospheres that leverage shame. What we said last week is, one, there is no place for shame in the church. There shouldn't be. And two, not only should we not have shame in the church, but really, if you come to understand what the problem is with us and what Jesus offers us, what we'll come to see is that our message is uniquely suited to solve the issue of shame. We said shame is one of the things that like keeps people away from church. Like maybe you're new here, maybe you don't consider yourself a church person, maybe you've been trying to keep church at an arm's length for a while. My guess is that probably, it may not be the whole reason, but probably what you're trying to avoid is shame, because shame is deeply painful and it's something we run from at all costs. So we're talking about shame. Now, we're in the second part of the series. So it might seem a little bit like, if you're new here and you weren't here last week, it might kind of seem like you're jumping in right in the middle of the program. And it's kind of because you are. But we'll try to fill you in on like the essential facts here. We're looking at the story in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Now, if you know the story, it's basically the story of two people who are naked in paradise. They're told they can't do one thing, and they go and do that, and down goes the human race, right? We know it as the story of like how sin entered the world, sin and guilt, right? But what we said last week is that it's so much more than that. However, before we really talk about that story, there's a few things we have to just kind of put out there, right? First of all, there's a talking animal in the story. And if I want you to understand me as a logical person, we can't just pretend like animals talk all the time and that's the norm. So let's acknowledge that, right? The second thing is that this is not necessarily an easy story to believe. There are some very, very educated people that do not believe that this actually happened. And there are some, like they believe that maybe it's a metaphor, still carries authority, but is some kind of metaphorical story. There are also people that believe, some very educated people that believe that this is how it happened, like exactly how it is. And there are arguments for both sides. But for the sake of this series, that's not the point. And I think if you'll just kind of take your doubts and reservations and like set them aside, what you'll see is that this story has some pretty powerful things to say to us. It is incredibly, like the more I read about it, the more my mind is blown, just at how accurately this speaks to the issues that we have as a human race. So, what's going on in the Garden of Eden? Well, if you were with us last week, you know that the one thing we know about the human race in paradise, if you think about it, they give us one description. It's kind of odd. All it tells us is that Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. That's a really weird description. That's not, if you were writing this story and had no recollection of that if you weren't familiar with the story, you probably wouldn't say that's what it's like to be in paradise, right? We might say like we were smiling all the time, or everything was amazing, it never rained, the sun was always shining, I lived on the beach, whatever, right? Paradise, we don't necessarily think of naked and no shame. But the idea here is that they are fully known and fully loved. They are completely exposed and completely embraced. They are completely accepted. They have a sense of belonging, and there is a deep sense of connection between the two of them. In the original language, in Hebrew, the language that this was written in, it says that they had no shame, but probably like a more accurate translation, the words are reciprocal, meaning like there was no shame between one another. Shame did not exist. And so they're completely exposed and completely embraced, fully known and fully loved, right? Now, this is, whether you realize it or not, this is what you and I, we crave this, and we love when we have it, and we want to see it, not just in ourselves, but in other people's relationships. Like, we love this. We were hardwired for this. Your closest friends, your favorite relationships, like the people you love having in your life, my guess is that it's pretty close to this, right? We'll say things like, well, they know the real me. Or I can be myself when I'm with them. I don't have to put up an act. They just know me, my good, my bad, my ugly, my whatever. They know me and they accept me anyway. That's the picture of paradise. We love that. We love that. And we want that. But if you know the story, things go bad, right? There's one thing that the man and the woman are not supposed to do, and they do it, and down goes the human race. And so now the question is, well, what does it look like when the human race goes down? What is the first thing we see when things go horribly wrong? Well, we're told that the eyes of both of them were opened. They started to see things differently. And what did they see? Themselves. They realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. They go from fully known and fully loved to now all of a sudden being aware of the eyes around them, like feeling afraid to be seen, pulling back, covering up, and being scared of what happens if you'll see the real me. Now all of a sudden there's this whole idea of covering. We call this shame. And if you look at the way the story is structured, there are like very clear indicators that the main theme of this story is what it looks like when shame enters into the equation. We said that shame it's not just embarrassment. It's the feeling of never being enough, of not measuring up. There's a shame researcher I introduced you to her last week. Her name is Brené Brown. She has some really great things to say about shame. She doesn't write from a faith perspective, like she's not a Christian author, but her books, they may as well be Christian books because they are so dead on with the points that we're talking about, with what the Genesis accounts record. And here's how she defines shame. She says that shame is the intensely painful feeling. And that's not like an exaggeration. There have been studies done, like the National Institute of Mental Health have found that experiences of shame are similar in the mind to like literally physically painful experiences. So she said it's the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed. And it's not the flawed part that's so bad. It's what comes after that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Not enough, and not just like not enough in general, but not good enough for you. Like not worthy of love. What we might say is that We can break this concept down. In fact, she uses these words interchangeably. Like love, we could say acceptance, belonging, and connection. Acceptance, belonging, and connection. We cannot live without these things. We can't. There is part of us that needs to know we are accepted, that we are enough, that we measure up. And with that acceptance comes a place of belonging. We need to feel like we're part of something. And then like that belonging then, of course, like leads itself to deep relational connection. We need this. Now, I don't know about you, but like love, like acceptance, belonging, connection. I don't really use those words, and so there's a little bit of a disconnect for me. Like I didn't wake up this morning like in search of acceptance, belonging, and connection, right? But really that's just an issue with language because we don't use those words. If you think about your greatest memories, your finest moments, the things like that, the stories you're gonna tell your grandchildren, what was so good about those things? What made those great experiences so great? My guess is it probably had to do with one of these three things. Like maybe it was some achievement, like, and not just the fact that it was accomplished, but that you accomplished it. That was a really good feeling. And what does that like ultimately trace back to? This feeling of adequacy, knowing you're enough, acceptance, right? Or maybe it was a season of life where you had this really close group of friends. It was like, oh, those were the glory days. It was on this team. It was with these people. It was with these girls, whatever. It's like those are my people. There's a sense of belonging there. Or maybe it's a deep connection. It's a relationship. Like that person, when I found them, everything, like our highest highs are because of this. And at the same time, our lowest lows are because of a lack of this. If you think of like some really, really painful moments in your life, it probably had to do with a lack of acceptance, like rejection, not feeling adequate, being told you're a failure, made to feel like you're not enough, or being like not belonging, being rejected, right? Like every kid has stood on the playground and like looked at the group they wanted to be part of and felt the pain of not belonging. It's a deeply painful, and it follows us all through life. Connection. If you've ever grieved over the death of a loved one, that you're grieving over the loss of connection. Our highest highs come back to this. Our lowest lows come back to this. And shame. And so now you could we have to get that to understand shame. Shame makes us think we are not worthy of this. And so it's painful and it's self-destructive. It actually causes us to do things that pull us further away from acceptance, belonging, and connection. So we need these things. Shame enters the picture in the story. And what do? The eyes of both of them are open. They realize that they're naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and they made coverings for themselves. They made coverings for themselves. All of a sudden, for the first time and forever after that, it becomes my job to present the best version of me that I can, so that you will find me to be worthy of acceptance, belonging, and connection. The ball's now in my court, according to the way Adam and Eve now see things, right? It's now their job to define their identity, who they are, because we can't go without this. They begin, to simplify it, they begin to control the way they are seen. And that's how we live. That's how we live. Once shame enters the story, we have to control the way we are seen because we need to be perceived as worthy of love and belonging, of acceptance, belonging, and connection. And so they start to cover because they have to, because these are they're irreducible needs. We need those to exist. We need those to thrive. So they grab the closest thing to them and they make coverings for themselves, right? We might call this, actually, one commentator who writes these like theological, scholarly articles, he calls this identity curation. He says curation. I'm not smart enough to use those words, so I'll just say identity management. Where now I have to manage and maintain who I am to you and who I am to me. And so we make coverings for ourselves. We do the same thing. We choose to decide how we want people to see us. We create the version of us that we are going to present to the world in the hope that the world will see us as worthy of acceptance, belonging, and connections. And so the question is, well, what are my coverings then, right? What do I use to like create this version of me that now I'm happy with people seeing? It's different for everybody. Like maybe for you, it's success. Maybe you need to be seen as a successful person. Maybe for you, it's being moral. Like you need to be seen as somebody who's moral, upright, religious. Maybe you need to be seen as a good mom, or you need to be seen as a good dad, or you need to be seen at like whatever it might be, fill in the blank. Think about it this way. What needs to be true of me in order for me to feel like I'm enough? Whatever that is, like those are the areas where we are the most susceptible to shame. To go back to this picture of nakedness, right? Just think, what covering, if ripped off of me or if challenged, would make me feel naked and exposed, would make me feel shame? If you can define what enough looks like, and the layers, there are like hundreds of them for us, right? Some are bigger than others, some are more important than others, but they're all over the place. We have tons of them. They differ according to how you define enough. Like somewhere in your life, at some point, somebody explained to you what it means to be enough, and that was the standard now that we tried to strive for, right? So I'll give you an example. There was a girl that I used to spend a lot of time with. And she was really smart, but she was never smart enough. Like she always had to be right. It could be the most random thing. Like we would be outside and I'd be like, oh, there's an oak tree. And she'd be like, nope, that's a pine tree. And I'd be like, oh, looks like it's been there for a long time. Actually, probably not. It might have been, transplanted. And it's like, okay. Like everything, she had to have the actuallys and the last words and always have to be the smartest person in the room. Sometimes it was a little bit exhausting, right? But eventually I just realized, all right, this is just this is the way it goes with this relationship here. And I just kind of, got over it. Sometime later, I had a conversation with her, totally random, and she explained to me, like very casually, she said, in my house at the dinner table, if somebody said something unintelligent, they were actually scolded. And I was like, well, now it all makes sense. That somebody set that bar for you. For you to be enough as a person, you need to reach this bar. And so like for me, if somebody tells me I'm smart, it's like, thanks, right? That there are things for me that are but really like the whole appearing as super intelligent, it's not really a thing for me. But for her, if somebody challenged her intellect, it was like as if someone were trying to rip off something, right? Have you ever seen someone get pants and you immediately have to put it back on? Like, no one has to tell you to pick up your pants. You feel them go down, and they go right back up. It's like that, like she would be talking and be like, actually, I don't know if you're right about that. She'd be like, well, no, actually, and it was like, boom. There is no way I'm gonna be caught as someone who's unintelligent. Why? Why? Because if that's what makes me worthy of what I need, then I have got to maintain that covering. And for you and for me, it may not be that. It may be something else. It may be being seen as an upright person. And so if somebody questions your morals, rather than being like, yeah, you know what? Yeah, you're probably right. I probably don't want the right thing. It's like, no, of course not, right? And we get defensive because we've got to protect our identity, like who we are. The question, and what makes this so difficult, is that these things in themselves, they're not bad. It's not bad to want to be smart. It's not bad to want to be morally upright. It's not bad to want to be good looking. It's not bad to want to be in good shape It's not bad to want to be successful, but the question is, are these things that I desire to be about me, or is this who I am? Is this who I need to be to measure up? There are problems with these coverings. There are problems. The first one is that they're ineffective. They just don't work. If you have got to be the prettiest person in the room, you will never be. You will never feel like you've gotten there, because shame is unquenchable. It's just the reality of it. If you've got to be seen as rich, you will never have enough money. If you've got to be seen as successful, you will never get to the point where you're like, well, I no longer be promoted because now no, it's unquenchable. And so it's ineffective. It's also fragile. Like if this is who you are, then your identity is incredibly fragile. If you need to be seen as an athlete because that's who you are, well, then the second you blow out your knee, you don't know who you are anymore. This is a real problem with professional athletes. Eventually they retire, and then they've spent their entire lives being the best one. It starts in elementary school. They're the best one there. They're the best one in middle school, best one in high school, best one in college. They make it to wherever they are, and then it's gone. You're done playing that sport, and they don't know who they are anymore, because it's not something about me. It's who I am. And that's where we're susceptible to shame. So they're ineffective, they're fragile, but they're also fake. And this is probably the most frustrating part of it. They don't even work. It goes back to the picture of paradise, right? We crave exposure and an embrace. Full exposure and a full embrace, right? But if I am controlling how I'm seen, if I'm controlling my exposure, then I know you're not seeing the real me. And so the embrace that I get from that, it's not real. It's counterfeit. And now I am forced to manage and maintain the fake image of me that I've created if I want to continue to have your acceptance. I think the best example of this is the movie Aladdin. You ever see Aladdin? If you haven't, you now have plans for the rest of the evening. Fantastic movie, all right? So it's about this boy who's he's poor. They call him a street rat. He's got to steal to survive, right? But then he falls in love with this princess, but the problem is he's not a prince, so he can't be with her. Then he meets this genie, and the genie makes him appear to be a prince, so he gets to be with Princess Jasmine. Now, if we didn't care about a real exposure and real embrace, the movie would end there. It'd be like, great, he got his wish. She thinks he's a prince, and he's got the girl. The end. But it's not. Why? Because we're all watching the movie going, just tell her who you really are. She's not embracing the real you. She's embracing Prince Ali, and that's not you. We crave that. We were wired for that. And when we see that things aren't like, we want them to be made right that way. But shame, when shame takes root, when I have created an image of myself that I'm presenting to the world, it will never let me stop pretending to be a prince. Never. The worst place we see this, one of the worst places, is on social media. Instagram and Facebook. It is hyper-controlled exposure and a cheap counterfeit embrace. I can take 65,000 pictures of me in the same room at different angles and finally find the right one where my forehead's not too shiny, but I don't have a double chin. And it's just like, and then I put the Valencia filter over it, and that's the one that's going out, right? And you're not gonna see when my kids just made a complete mess of their room, or when, I have an outburst because I can't take it. You're gonna see when they're dressed up, ready for Easter, and everybody's it's hyper-controlled exposure. And then where's the embrace? The likes. Your brain actually has a response. Every time you get a like, your brain, there's a neurological response there, because we were wired to show ourselves and to be received. We want that. But when it's a fake, hyper-controlled exposure, it's a counterfeit, it's a cheap embrace. And so it doesn't even do the job, because you know and I know that that's not the real you. I'm not saying social media is bad, but I'm saying if we're not aware of that, it can just take our shame and accelerate it to the max. especially because you're comparing your behind the scenes to everybody else's highlight reel. It can be a dangerous thing. So it's ineffective, it's fragile, it's fake. So what do we do? Right? What do we do then with shame? I mentioned this shame researcher. Her name's Brené Brown. She writes a lot of great stuff. She has some really profound things to say. And she gives a solution, but I think it falls a little bit short. She says the difference between people who know how to handle shame and the people who don't is simply that the people who can handle their shame, they simply believe they are worthy of love and acceptance. They believe it. And I think that's good. But it's incomplete. Because you have to have some kind of grounds for believing something, right? And so if you grew up with parents that constantly told you that you're worth it and they love you and this, well, maybe you'll be pretty resilient to shame off the bat. But what happens when you start to question your parents' judgment? Or what if that relationship erodes? Or what if the person that has caused you to believe you're worth something, what if they change their mind? What if those are the same people that actually start destroying us as people? Well, there goes my entire sense of identity, right? Or they'll say you have to believe it deep down in your heart, because if you believe you're worth something, then you are worth something. And I think the issue with that is that we're too smart for our own good. We know that something's not true just because we choose to believe it, right? If I said this stool is worth $1 million, right? Took the tag off. This stool is worth $1 million. You'd be like, yeah, good luck with that. And if I sat there and I was like, no, really, 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 really it is. It doesn't matter how hard I try. But if someone came along and paid $1 million for this stool, all of a sudden it might be worth something, right? And that's our story. That's our story. It brings us right back to where we were last week. Jesus doesn't just say you're worth something to him. He paid the price for you. He doesn't just take away your sin. He doesn't just forgive all of it. He says I will take it. I will take it. If you look at the language, the way that Jesus is described over and over again, he bears the weight of our issues. He doesn't just say, okay, forget about it. He's I care for you so much that I will have that instead of you. I will deal with what it's like to live with that. In his letter to the church in Rome, and I showed you this last week, but this is the answer. This is the answer here. The Apostle Paul says that God demonstrates his love for us. He shows us here's how. Here it is. It's on display. While we were still sinners, while we were flawed, not when we got it together, not when we signed the membership pamphlet to the church, not after we did the X, Y, and Z or checked the box, not in your mess, in your nastiness, in your hatred and resistance of God. That's when he died for us, to show us that we are worth his love. You know what something is worth when you see what someone is willing to pay for it. And if that sinks in, then all of a sudden, it starts to disarm the power of shame. Your parents might tell you that they love you, and that's good. That if they do that, they are good parents for doing that. And if you're a parent, you should do that for your kids too. But you can't build your identity on who they say you are, because you might find out that they're wrong about certain things. And maybe, I hope not, but maybe they'll be the ones to tell you that you're not worth something. That's a real thing that happens. But when there is someone who says no matter what you do, no matter how nasty you are, in spite of your performance, I have purchased I am the only one who has the right to tell you what you're worth because I paid for it. The reason most people don't care about what Jesus has done is because they don't understand what it means for their lives. He has disarmed the power of shame. And so I showed you this last week, but we'll do it again. If shame says that you are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and acceptance, then Jesus says that you are flawed. Yes, you are. You are, absolutely. But in spite of that, you are deeply loved and completely accepted. And the cool thing about that is when that clicks, you no longer have to fear your flaws. The bad thing about shame is not that you made a mistake. It's the conclusion that shame causes us to draw because of those inadequacies. Like if this sinks in, then you know what? I can look at my kids and be like, yeah, I messed that up. But I can own that because that's not who I am. Right? Okay, so I shouldn't have done this. Like this mistake that I made doesn't line up with the values that I'm trying, and we can own it. We don't have to be so afraid of coming up short because not being enough is independent of whether or not we are worthy of love and acceptance because of what Jesus has done. I'm going to call the band up here, and then I'll leave you with this story. So when I was younger, my brother and I were 5 years apart, and we played a lot, but I also, 5 years is a long time, I kind of had the chance to watch him grow up a little bit. And I remember when he first started dealing with shame. When he would go to school, and for the first time, kids can be cruel to each other. And they would tell him that he was stupid or weird or ugly. And I was like a very private child when I was growing up, but my brother was very open. And he processed things with my parents. He would just come up and talk to them about it. And I remember when he brought this up to my parents. We would be in the basement. He walked upstairs and sat them down. He looked at them and he said, "Am I ugly? Am I weird? Am I stupid?" And I remember every single time their response, immediately, instinctively, there would be this sense of pain for their child, this sense of outrage. And immediately they would look at him and they would go, "Who told you that?" As if to say who have you given the right to tell you who you are? And what's really interesting is that this whole scene in the garden, God comes looking for the people and they're hiding. And when God calls Adam, he comes out and he says, "I heard you coming, so I hid because I was naked. I was ashamed." And you know what God says? He says, "Who told you that? Who have you given the right to tell you who you are?" And maybe that's you today, deep in your shame. Maybe you feel inadequate. Maybe you feel like a failure. Maybe you feel like you don't quite measure up. Maybe you're living in this world of identity management so that the people who have seen you will consider you worthy of love, of acceptance, belonging, and connection. And maybe that has made you think somehow, because you don't quite measure up, maybe it's made you think that somehow that makes you worth less. And maybe God would look at you today and say, "Who told you that?" He has purchased the right to tell you who you are. Nobody else. And in his eyes, whether you are good, bad, pretty, ugly, big, small, fill in the blank, no matter where you are, he has proven that you are worthy of his love, exactly as you are right now, today. Let's pray together. God, we are so grateful that you have gone so far to handle a mess that we've made for ourselves. You've done things that you don't have to. You have paid a price that you didn't have to pay. And because of that, we can live in freedom. We don't have to be afraid of being flawed. God, would you allow this today to not just be another time where we hear the story about Jesus? Would you allow it to sink deep into our hearts, to hit something this time? Would you allow it to remind us that no matter how we perform, God, our identity is not based on how we do, but on what you've done for us. Let us rest in that. In Jesus' name we pray.